Hi, welcome back to Videos from the Ville. This is Professor Charles Greenewalt. This is Introduction to City Planning. And this particular lecture is going to be about the overview of American urbanization. You can follow along on your PowerPoints if you would, please. Let's take a look at urbanization in America. We took a look at urbanization broadly across the globe. Let's turn our sights now to our home country. We find that some of the best work that has been done in looking at American urbanization has been done over the years by Arthur Schlesinger. Arthur Schlesinger wrote a brilliant work called A Panoramic View, The City in American History. A panoramic view. This is a city in American history. We find that most writers, most observers, most thinkers about American history, all the way until the 1930s and the 1940s, they looked upon the city with hostility. They looked upon the city with ambivalence. They looked upon the city with what we might refer to as mixed pride. Find that Whitney Griswold, and there's a slide there with a painting of Whitney Griswold on Time magazine. He wrote a famous book called Farming and Democracy. Farming and Democracy, and in there he discussed the quote-unquote the moral ascendancy of agriculture, unquote. Quote, the moral ascendancy of agriculture, unquote. And he also entertained themes of small-town America, of frontier growth, and of pastoralism. You find that there were a whole host of writers that followed Whitney Griswold in this field of inquiry in this area throughout the 1930s. Schlesinger worked along with another individual by the name of Dixon Ryan Fox. And Dixon Ryan Fox and Schlesinger wrote a 12-volume history of American life. A history of American life, and they wrote this over a period of a decade, over a period of 10 years. And the most notable volume in the whole collection was Schlesinger's volume, The Rise of the City. The Rise of the City was written and published in 1933. And again, The Rise of the City is that's one volume of this 10-volume series called A History of American Life. What happened in The Rise of the City is that he sought to reconsider American history, to reconsider American history from an urban point of view, and to view urbanization, to view the urban movement as the unifying theme of American history, as the dominant theme of American history. He believed that that is the correct way to interpret and to look at American history. We find that traditionally we had been looking at American history through the lens or the focus of someone like a Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner in 1920, in his book, The Frontier in American History, again, Frederick Jackson Turner in 1920, in his book, The Frontier in American History, he believed that the movement west, the westward movement, was the dominant and unifying theme in American history. We find that as time went by, Turner began to have doubts about his thesis, even though it was the prevalent and the accepted one. And even in 1925, in private correspondence, Turner wrote that, quote, there seems likely to be an urban reinterpretation of our history, unquote. So Frederick Jackson Turner in 1925, in a private letter, wrote, quote, there seems likely to be an urban reinterpretation of our history, unquote. Well, the struggle on how to interpret American history and what prism we should look at American history through. It demonstrates one of the most important themes in American history, and that theme is this interplay, a constant interplay between the city on one side and the countryside on the other side. As our nation has evolved and as our history has progressed, we've constantly had the interplay of the city and the countryside. And how should we interpret American history? Well, let's take a look at American urbanization, and we'll divide it into a number of eras. In the first period, we will look at the years between 1607 and 1820. Between 1607 and 1820. We'll call this the early period. How's that for an interesting, an innovative name, the early period. So the early period is between 1607 and 1820. We find that agriculture during this period of time had been occupying the vast majority of colonies, and you find that they had a personal liking or an economic, a personal liking of agriculture, or they had economic motivations from agriculture to prefer country living to the town life. But usually the first endeavor that colonists perform after reaching the colonies was to form an urban community. And this urban community would serve as a means of companionship, and the urban community would serve as a means for natural protection from most likely Native Americans. Well, in this early period, again, between 1607 and 1820, towns would not only provide companionship, and they would provide natural protection, but you find that they also served as commercial centers, and as commercial centers, they provided us with access to imported goods primarily from Europe, and imported goods were very important to have access to them, because this would have encompassed hardware, tools, firearms, medicines, books, house furnishings, and without those things, life in the colonies would have been indeed very, very primitive. So you find that these small colonial towns that we're building during this period, they were roughly the size of very small English provincial cities before the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution elevated and increased all their populations. You find as America grows and as larger American towns gain a corporate consciousness, they reached out for dependent territories, and they competed against each other for economic domination. You find that Boston becomes the first city to enter this race for economic domination of an area, and they were in a advantageous position. They perhaps were in the best position during the first century between 1607 and 1820. But we find that soon entering the race behind Boston was New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston. So shortly after Boston enters this competition for control of the hinterlands. New York City is in the fray. Philadelphia enters the contest, and then Baltimore and Charleston are coming up behind. All of them are growing, and they're all establishing an economic sway, if you will, over the territories that are close by. I have in your PowerPoints some pictures for you of Independence Hall in Philadelphia and what that looks like, Beacon Hall in Boston, and the East India Trading Company, the warehouse based in New York City. We find it up through the end of the up through the latter portion of the 18th century, through the late 1700s, we find as beneficial as relations of countryside towns were with larger cities, urban dominance would breed resentment and it bred jealousies. You find slowly but surely the city became a symbol. It became a symbol of deception, a symbol of greed. And you can still see this resonate here in Pennsylvania politics with our view of Philadelphia and Philadelphia politics. You find that one of the themes in Pennsylvania politics is this competition that occurs between Philadelphia and rural Pennsylvania. Well, even from the beginning, as cities are built and cities are settled, city inhabitants had to deal with city problems, even from the beginning. As much as they were not as great a problem as they would be later, even the early inhabitants of American cities had to deal with the question of street lighting, fire protection, care of the streets, who's going to fill those potholes or replace those cobblestones, crime prevention, sewage treatment, sewage disposal, I should say, availability of water, who's going to look after community health, and the marketing of products that we're producing. All of those problems that I just mentioned sparked action. They all caused reactions so that American city services quickly matched those from English cities of comparable size. Americans were very anxious to see that they acquired these services and to see if they couldn't do it better than their sister cities in England or comparably sized English cities. So how did that happen? Well, the citizens, number one, they would take turns at night maintaining the night watch. So they are accepting a call, they're accepting a charge for policing. Policing would be done by someone other than someone paid directly by the state. You find that citizens very quickly are taking up the task of removal of garbage. And for the removal of garbage, many relied on simply roaming goats, roaming pigs in their city. This problem of drainage is one that's always been hard to tackle. This was largely an unsolved problem, even through today. A few communities were able to build private sewers. They weren't happy with their public attempts, so they went ahead and they built private sewers. And of course, we also have volunteer fire companies. So you find that slowly but surely the people of the cities developed a pattern of life. They developed a pattern of life that was increasingly unlike, increasingly different from that of the countryside or of the frontier. You find that this concern with general welfare contradicted the doctrine of individualism that we tend to think of in regard to this concern with the general welfare contradicted this doctrine of individualism, and it bred a sense of social responsibility. So that's something that's different from life in the city alone to how things finally shook out. City life had transforming effects on many of its residents. Slowly but surely there was a greater knowledge of the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the knowledge of the 3 R's was far more widespread in rural areas, as well as the presence of bookstores. The presence of bookstores, presence of universities, presence of newspapers. All these things stimulate, they stir mental activities among urban residents where they weren't available to rural residents. So we find that city life has a transforming effect on many of its residents, simply through a knowledge of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And this was promoted by presence of bookstores, universities, and newspapers. Okay. After 1820, we see an astounding rate of growth. After 1820, the cities grow much, much, much more quickly than they do in the country. Let's take a look at where Americans lived and see how this changes over time. We'll look at the years 1790, 1820, 1840, 1860, and 1890. So again, we're looking at 1790, 1820, 1840, 1860, and 1890. Let's start with 1790. 1 out of every 30 Americans lives in a settlement of 8,000 or more. So in 1790, 1 out of 30 Americans lived in a settlement of 80,000 or more. By 1820, 1 out of 20 Americans lives in a settlement of 8,000 people or more. By 1840, it goes from, in 1790, it was 1 out of 30. 1890, 1820, it's 1 out of 20. It's 1 out of 20. In 1840, it's 1 out of 12. In 1860, it's 1 out of 6. And in 1890, it's only 1 out of 3 Americans lived in a settlement of 8,000 people or more. Well, after 1820, we find in the eastern United States, there were scores of new cities that sprang up. And these new cities were generally almost always at the fall line of American rivers. The fall line where the water would be coming down from the rivers, from the mountains, I should say, and at some point it would fall and go off to the ocean. This is where settlers, when they were coming upstream, would place their first set of mills, and the mills would be powered through the water power then. Yes, so in Eastern America, there's scores and scores of new cities that sprang up after 1820, almost always built at the fall line where water power was available. We find that with the settlement of the area beyond the Appalachian Mountains, we find finally it's down to a gigantic struggle between New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. They were engaging in a struggle for who was going to be the trading and commercial center with the western part of the United States. Well, finally New York wins this competition, and how does it do it? New York wins this competition pure and simple through the construction, the completion of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, along with other rail connections and other canal connections, established itself as a conduit. It was a conduit for goods and services from the Middle West to the East. And they didn't worry about that. Okay, let's take a look here. We have the completion of the Erie Canal. We have the completion of rail connections on and off the Erie Canal. And this allows New York City to jump ahead in the race for predominance through rural areas in America. We find that yes, New York City is able to win this because the Erie Canal comes right across from Lake Erie, comes right across the center of New York State and down the Hudson River Valley. You find that also city authorities, before 1820, city authorities in America are reluctant, very reluctant, to provide new facilities and new services. And the new services and facilities would only do what? They would increase taxes. No one wanted to increase taxes. So places were provided for the general public and kept up for the general public through taxes, and the people were loath to pay new taxes. So they would only willingly pay larger taxes if there was some extraordinarily necessary thing to do. You find Philadelphia set up a city water supply after a series of yellow fever outbreaks in the 1790s. But after 1820, we find urban improvements are rapidly increasing across the land. They're slowly increasing. What were some of these urban improvements? Well, the urban improvements after 1820 would include over 100 municipal waterworks. So you have 100 different municipalities creating their own system to provide water, their own municipal waterworks. So those were done before the Civil War. In 1822, Boston adopts gas lighting in 1822. In 1823, you find that Boston instilled the first publicly owned sewer system in 1823. In 1823, you find that regular stagecoach service starts in the streets of New York City. So you have a regular service there. In 1822, would we say that Boston had gas lighting? 1823, the publicly owned sewage system. 1823, you had regular stagecoach service on the streets of New York. And in 1830, New York City introduced, you find horse-drawn car lines. You would have a railroad track, you would have a railroad car, but that railroad car would be pulled by a horse. Volunteer firefighters continued to be the norm, continued to be the rule of the day, and that was true until 1837. It was true until 1837. Boston, in 1837, created a paid municipal fire department. A paid municipal fire department. That was in 1837. Well, a large number of our most important social movements in America began in the cities also at this time. What are some of these movements? Well, how about the drive for free public education? The drive for free public education, more humane treatment of the insane, the drive for free public libraries, penal reform, women's rights, anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement, and the start of the labor movement. They all began in the cities. Find that many of the working men who were traveling a bit in the 1830s, they organized trade unions along the seaboard, and after they organized labor unions along the seaboard, then they moved inland, to inland ports such as Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. So Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis are all places where they would rather set up shop. So we have, again, a number of social movements that began in the cities after 1820, the drive for free public education, more humane treatment of the insane, the drive for free public libraries, penal reform or prison reform, the women's rights movement, the anti-slavery movement, and the start of the labor movement. And workmen in the 1830s organized trade unions along the seaboard, and later they would be going inland to Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, and they would be faced with questions later about whether or not it might be time or not for a union, for example. Well, between 1820 and 1860, we have the growing importance of cities. Cities become more and more important in the country, and this starts to generate a fear, generate a resentment among rural residents across the land. Why is only the adults' opinion not that important at this point? So from 1820 to 1860, we have the growing importance of cities, creating great fear and resentment among rural residents of America. So from 1820 to 1860, the growing importance of cities created fear and resentment among rural residents in America. You find that ministers in the country denounce big cities. We find that farm journals exhort young men not to abandon the farm for a proposition where they would be involved with degrading urban slavery. And there were a large number of books that were published that warned you about the cities, how you should stay in the countryside. Books such as Vampires of New York, and books such as The Tricks and the Traps of New York. The Tricks and the Traps of New York. So Arthur Schlesinger says that perhaps we need to consider that the Civil War was a revolt as well against the urban imperialism of the North. That the Civil War wasn't simply about states' rights or about slavery, but it was also about urban imperialism that you found being conducted in the South by the North. The resentment of this urban imperialism can be found. You can find it in the pages of the Charleston Mercury. On May the 20th, 1858, on May the 20th, 1858, in the pages of the Charleston Mercury, you have the sentence that says, quote, Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, are only suburbs of New York City. They're only suburbs of New York City. Well, we find southern cities and southern towns began to give and endorse their strong support for separation from the North, leaving the North. By 1890, we find that New York City and Brooklyn possess 2.5 million people. So by 1890, you find New York City and Brooklyn possess 2.5 million people. That is about the size of Paris. Well, with New York and Brooklyn having 2.5 million people and rivaling Paris, we find that Chicago and Philadelphia are moving up as well. Chicago and Philadelphia both have more than 1 million people, and they are ranked as the 6th and the 7th largest cities in the Western world. So Chicago is the 6th largest city, and Philadelphia is the 7th largest city in the Western world. You find that American historians were preoccupied. They were preoccupied with the dispersion, the flow of settlers over the wide expanse of the public domain over the West. And American historians have given scant attention to the significant counter-movement, things going the other way. You find that the pull of cities was so great that it depopulated some rural areas. Between 1880 and 1890, 2/5 of all Pennsylvania townships lost population to the cities. More than 2/3 of New York's localities shared the same experience. From 1790 to 1890, the population of the nation rose 16-fold. So between 1690 and 1890, the population of the nation rises 16%, but the population of the cities rises 139%. That's simply an amazing statistic. So from 1790 to 1890, the population of the nation rose 16-fold, huge, but the population of the cities rose 139 times over, 139%. Well, we find in this modern era of American cities that one of the foremost writers is Walt Whitman. And we find that Walt Whitman writes extensively about the American city. Walt Whitman glorifies the city and says it's the most comprehensive of all of the works of man. The city is the most comprehensive. Schlesinger believes that cities made their greatest contribution as a cultural force. Museums, new universities, printing houses, public libraries, and music schools all increase in number in the modern era of American cities. Well, the relationship between the cities and the countryside is not static. It's a dynamic relationship, and in the 1890s it's fundamentally altered again. We find that the relationship between the cities and the countryside and the nature of this relationship has important and significant effects on American civilization. We find that many historians will suggest that the rural revolt against the cities subsided in the 1890s, so that you could have the discovery of gold, the discovery of new sources of gold, and still generate a large following. Schlesinger tells us that a better explanation for the relationship between the countryside and the city. Better explanation can be found in the amelioration, the waning of many of the social and psychological drawbacks of rural life. So as we have drawn back on these liabilities, if you will, the shortcomings of rural life, then you find that this leads to more appeal on behalf of the cities. Well, what are some of the conditions in the rural areas that were improved and made the city perhaps not as appealing as it had been? Well, as rural areas engage in these things, they become more competitive. Number one, the expansion of rural schools. As rural schools are expanded, then people don't have to send their children or transport them themselves into urban areas. You have the rapid extension of good roads, and you find that the good roads are moving more and more because of the bicycle craze. You have the introduction of rural free postal delivery. The introduction of rural free postal delivery with the spread of telephones, and telephones were going into farmhouses as well as out to the barn. You find that another thing that went out was the penetration of the countryside by an increasing number of interurban trolley lines. As the countryside becomes greater, penetrated over and over again by this network of interurban trolley lines, this is a big difference. The automobile, a huge difference between a city dweller and a country dweller, the presence of the automobile. Also the spread of farm phones, that as everyone has access to a telephone, that makes living in the country not nearly as arduous as it had before that time. Well, this modern era of cities, we find that throughout the 1930s, we find that radio and movies were bringing urban life more and more into rural communities. So we find that tractors are built. Tractors and other labor-saving devices, and they minimize the need for so much human labor. So radios and movies bring urban life into the rural communities. Tractors and other labor-saving devices lighten the drudgery of rural labor. And we find that between 1900 and 1935, the mechanical power used in agriculture in America, the mechanical power grew by over 8 times. So the amount of power that was available to farmers between 1900 and 1835, the mechanized power used in agriculture grew 8-fold. It became 8 times greater. Well, while rural life was becoming more urbanized, urban life was becoming more rural. So rural life is becoming more urbanized, urban life is becoming more rural. You have parks, you have playgrounds, and tree-lined streets. Parks, playgrounds, and tree-lined streets were multiplying way out of proportion to the population. We have larger number of city workers. We're now using different transit lines to go further and further into the suburbs as well. So we find that people are changing, perhaps their preferences are changing as to where they wish to live. Well, the conclusion for the modern era of American cities is that America has developed a new type of civilization. America has developed a new type of civilization. A new type of civilization that the world has never seen. The old, hard and fast distinction between urban areas and rural areas is one that is slowly disappearing. We have a new form of society, a new form of society which blends the best features of these two traditional modes of life, where you have the advantages of the city and also the disadvantages are changed. So America has developed a new type of civilization such as the world has never seen. The distinction between urban and rural has disappeared, and there's a new form of society that blends the best features of both forms of life, or both lifestyles. And that brings an end to this section on American urbanization. Let's change and go to the next subject in just a minute.